Hey everyone, how's it going? Forrest here, again with another installment of my complete analysis of all of J.S. Bach's chorale harmonizations. Today we're looking at Herr Gott, dich, loben, alle, which translates to Lord God, we all praise you. Fairly straightforward chorale, not too long as well. I think visually speaking, the thing that makes this chorale stick out amongst the rest is the activity and the bass line. I don't know what Bach was thinking when he wrote this bass line, but surely it was supposed to be the star of the show, that's for sure. The harmony is fairly straightforward, really not too much to write home about. A couple of interesting chords here and there, but really fairly straightforward chorale. So we're just going to hop right into the analysis. We have two flats in the key signature. We start on B flat major, and we end on B flat major. I reckon the overall tonality of the chorale is B flat major. We have a passing tone here in the bass here before we get G, D, G, and B flat, which is our 6th chord, G minor. Passing tone in the bass, B flat, D, G, and B flat's just taking our chord and putting it in first inversion. No need to reiterate the Roman numeral. Another passing tone here in the bass before we get a bit of an interesting progression here. We have D, D, F, and A. So I'm going to be a little bit more on the literal side of things here and call this a 3 chord, but with this B flat here as well, which is a non-chord tone, I feel like it's maybe with this movement here of D going to B flat, going to E, it kind of feels like we're moving towards an E flat idea, and that's why I feel like this D minor chord might be a little bit more appropriate of an analysis. But if you took this B flat into account, I think calling this a tonic 7th could be interesting as well, where we have maybe this A functioning kind of as like a suspended 7th in the melody. It's kind of interesting. All in all, I think it's more so a D minor chord than anything else. But then we get E flat, E flat, B flat, E flat, and G, which is our 4 chord. Passing tone in the bass. It's a very similar contour to what happened in the previous phrase. We have G, B flat, E flat, and G, which is our 6th chord. Our 6th chord. I wrote a number 6, so I said our 6th chord. It's still our 4 chord, just in first inversion, so we don't need to reiterate the Roman numeral. Another passing tone in the bass, and then we have B flat, D, and F, which is our tonic triad, B flat major, with a passing 7th in the bass. And as we're closing in on our imperfect authentic cadence here, we have G, B flat, D, and B flat, which is another 6th chord, a lot of 1 going to 6 in this chorale, passing 7th in the bass, E, B flat, G, and C. That's C minor 7 over E flat, which is 2, 6, 5. 6 typically goes to 2, or we often see it go to 2, and 2, 6, 5. We know that Bach loves 2, 6, 5 chords in cadential contexts. Neighbor tone here in the bass before we get E flat, A, F, and C. We're going to see another situation where we see this E flat passing up to the F here. I think this E flat's an accented non-chord tone though, just because the fact that if that were actually the 7th of the chord and we're resolving the way we would expect, we typically expect to see it go to D here in the bass. So I feel like it's just like the bass is very active and he's following this motion that he set up, and we've seen this in the past before as well, where Bach starts on a 5 chord especially, and he'll arrive on the root of the chord late. Just so happens that the passing tone leading into the root of the chord is a 7th, but maybe this is a 4-2 chord that has some unusual resolution, who knows. But afterwards we have our tonic triad, B flat, F, and D. We have another phrase here that ends in the key of B flat major. This time, however, it's a half cadence. We start off with some secondary harmony here. We have F sharp, A, and D, which is D major over F sharp, 5, 6 of 6, because D's the dominant to G, and G is our 6, and that goes to G minor, G, B flat, G, and D. If I didn't know any better, I'd feel like we were in the key of G minor at this point, but it really feels like Bach is sort of alluding to G minor at the same time as B flat happening. But he starts all the phrases off with a G minor chord until we get to the end, if I'm not mistaken. But yes, or with the idea of G minor. I guess he's technically not starting the phrase with G minor, but we have G minor as an idea here. D is a chord tone, and it briefly puts us in 6/4. I feel like ultimately here he's just sort of scaling this octave, and as opposed to leaping an octave, he uses the fifth to get there, but we have an intact 6/4 chord, so similar to how I mark 6 chords when they are subdivided in the chorales, I'm going to mark this as 6/4. After our 6/4, we have G minor again, G, B flat, G, and D, so we don't need to mark it. Passing 7th in the bass. Oh, sorry, I guess we should put a 5/3 here, huh? Because we did mark this as 6/4, or I guess I marked this as 6/4. But after our 6th chord with the passing 7th, we have E flat, B flat, G, and D. That's E flat major 7 in root position, which is 4/7 in the key of B flat major. Interesting to see 6 go to 4. It's not the most common progression, but we have seen it from time to time in Bach. This D is a passing 7th, but it's part of the chord. It's kind of happening at the same point metrically here as well, which makes me feel like maybe this is a stronger argument for this to be a tonic 7th chord, because we have the melody functioning as the 7th of the chord in both contexts. It's just the bass is a little different in this situation. I don't know. Maybe that's something to read into when trying to compare the phrases symmetrically. But after our 4/7 chord, we have E flat, B flat, G, and C, which is C minor 7 over E flat. We know that Bach loves 2/6/5 chords, and we have a 6th bass progression here. 1. We can technically throw 5/6 of 6 in there as well because it's an intermediary chord, but really 1/6/4/2 being the big picture here. Kind of an interesting series of thirds based chords. And 2 just ends up being a way to reframe the idea of reintroducing the tonic as a predominant chord. C is our C is a chord tone, so we don't need to mark it. But then we have F, A, F, and C, which is our 5 chord, F major with the passing 7th in the bass, and that resolves to our 1, D, B flat, F, and D, which is 1/6 more specifically. We have a passing tone in the bass as well before we get B flat, C, F, and E flat. I reckon this B flat's an accented non-chord tone, and this is actually F7 over A, which is 5/6/5. And that resolves to our tonic, B flat, F, and D, which is our root position tonic more specifically. Passing tone in the bass. Changing the bass to D just takes this chord and puts it in first inversion, just like we've seen earlier with these chords. Just we don't need to reiterate the Roman numeral, just change the figured bass. Another passing tone in the bass as well. A lot of passing tones in the bass because it's really the only voice that has any activity that could be constituted as a passing tone in this chorale, just because of its activity. And then we cadence on 5, F, A, F, and C. Going into the next phrase, we have the first and only modulation in the chorale where we end in the key of G minor, but we stay in B flat for pretty much the majority of the phrase. So we'll stay in, B flat frame of mind until we get to about the halfway mark, maybe a little bit beyond the halfway mark. We start off the phrase, again, just like the phrase we just analyzed, with the idea of G minor, G, D, G, and B flat. It's our 6th chord. And then we get A, C, F, and C, which is our 5 chord in first inversion. F is a chord tone, so we don't need to mark it. We then have G, C, F, and C. G is a non-chord tone here. I think we're still alluding to this idea of 5, more specifically 5/6. And then we get B flat, F, and D, which is our tonic triad in root position. G is a non-chord tone. B flat is a chord tone, so we don't need to mark it. It's kind of like we have a little passing 6 chord here. I'll mark it just because it doesn't hurt to, but I don't think it's having too much of an impact on the progression. Actually, I take that back. It might be having a stronger impact on the progression just because of the fact that we go from 6 in this subdivided context here to 2. We have E flat, B flat, G, and C, which is 2/6/5, and we know that Bach loves 2/6/5 chords, especially in cadential contexts, but here we're seeing it kind of mid-phrase, just like we saw in the previous phrase. And this could be just because of the overall form of the melody, but also because a logical place for a 6th chord to go. D is a neighbor tone here, so we will mark that. And then we have E flat, A, F, and C. Very interesting situation here, similar to how we end our phrase at the beginning of the chorale, where we have 5, which I think this is just a 5-7 chord, but I think it's also possible to call this a 5-4-2 chord because of the E flat and the placement. But to me it feels like this E flat sort of functioning as an accented passing tone, but I'm not going to bother marking it because it's part of the overall picture, and really it doesn't matter too much. It's just kind of unusual to see the 4-2 resolve this way, but that's definitely something to take note of in this chorale, is the fact that there is this potential 5-4-2 chord that isn't resolving like we would expect if this E flat really is functioning as the base of the chord. But like I said, I don't really think it's making too much of an impact on the progression because it feels like the bass just might be lagging a beat behind here. But the E flat does look like it's intentional just because of the fact that it is, placed twice. We have some rotation here between the alto and the bass, where we have a 9th turn into a 7th by virtue of the stepwise motion. But after 5-7, we get not B flat major. The upper voices might indicate that we are going to B flat, right? B flat, D, and B flat. But this G right here means that this is a G minor chord. And G minor is our tonic triad in the key of G minor as well. We then have E flat, B flat, G, and G, which is E flat major in root position. That is our 6th chord, and similar to the cadences we've seen before, or I guess the cadence in the first phrase. 6 is sort of functioning as like a pre-cadential chord, or a pre-dominant. B flat is a chord tone. D is it looks like a passing 7th, but it's not. It's just a 7th that's happening in this ascending configuration here. Then we get C, E flat, G, and A, which is A minor 7 flat 5 over C. That's 2-6-5. We know that Bach loves 2-6-5 chords, especially in cadential situations, and this is a cadential situation for sure. A is also a chord tone, so we don't need to mark it. And then we get D, D, F sharp, and A, which is our 5 chord, which is where we would expect a 2-6-5 chord to go, some type of 5 chord, especially in a cadential context. And then our imperfect authentic cadence concludes with G minor, G, D, G, and B flat, which is our tonic triad in root position, G minor. Our last phrase ends with a perfect authentic cadence in the key of B flat major, and I think this G minor chord is our gateway back to the key of B flat major. It's now our 6th chord. Moving things along, we have A, C, F, and F, which is our 5 chord in first inversion. We then have B flat, D, F, and D, which is our tonic triad in root position. Neighbor tone in the bass. B flat's still our root here, it's still our bass as well, so we don't need to write anything. Passing the 7th in the bass before we get G, D, G, and B flat. It's our 6th chord, G minor. Passing 7th in the bass, and then we get E flat, A, F, and C. Again, Bach playing with this idea of F being our dominant, but also just ambiguous about whether or not this is a 7 chord, or ambiguous whether or not the F is actually the root, because here it's very possible that this could be a 5-4-2 chord, but I feel like E flat and G are sort of enclosing around F in the grander, sort of scheme of things, and this is actually a 5 chord, just because it's not really resolving the way that we would expect. Really, just the only reason why I'm sort of like in contention about how to analyze this is because even though Bach has sort of presented these 5 chords all in situations where there are irregular resolutions, if you look at the surface, there's not really sort of a clear indication as to whether or not this is a 5-4-2, because the bass is moving so quickly for starters, and also the fact that it always feels like it's part of a bigger picture. Like, what exactly is the bass in this 5 chord when it's moving so quickly? To me, my eyes see E flat and G surrounding F, which feels more like a root in the big picture of things, but also contributing to a bigger picture is the fact that we have a change in melody here, where C goes to E flat and it, again, just like the E flat that we saw here, it feels like the E flat is meaningful in the grand scheme of this measure, which is pretty much entirely devoted to the 5 chord. So whether or not this is a 5 chord or a 5-4-2, I think it's largely negligible. I think all in all, I'm just sort of looking for the way that the 5 chord resolves, and 5-4-2 typically resolves, and I'm talking in the context of Bach here, to a triad that's like a fifth below and in first inversion. And with the bass moving the way that it does here, it doesn't quite feel like it's settled on a chord tone yet. So if we treat every chord like exactly how it's happening on the downbeat, instead of taking the aggregate of everything that's going on, we might be missing the the big picture. But F is a chord tone, that's how I'm sort of looking at it. E flat's still a passing 7th, and then we get D, A, F, and E flat, again with this situation where we have a chord where it's clearly an F7 chord, but we don't get the realization until after the beat. So it's like with these 5 chords, it's ambiguous because the context is there, but it's not fully realized. It's the C that we need in order to fully contextualize the chord here. And that would just be taking the 5 chord and putting it in second inversion and adding the 7th. That is, if this wasn't already a 5-4-2 chord in your analysis. I think all in all, there are lots of different ways to interpret this measure, lots of different ways to interpret the different 5 chords that were going on throughout the chorale before in earlier phrases, but really it's kind of the big, I think, hallmark of this particular chorale is how the 5 chords are somewhat ambiguous due to the presence of E flat being the first tone in the bass and then it just rising up to F. Makes it a little complicated to analyze or really settle on one thing and say that one particular analysis is right, because there's nuance and shades of gray. There's possibility here. But 5 eventually resolves to our tonic, B flat, F, and D, which is in root position. D takes our chord here. It's a chord tone, and it briefly takes our chord and puts it in first inversion before we get E flat. Kind of gives us a vibe of what was happening here, where we have D, B flat, E. Here we have B flat, D, E, just the rising configuration here. But then we have E flat, B flat, G, and C, which is C minor 7 over E flat. Again, Bach loving his 2-6-5 chords in cadential situations. This C is a chord tone, so we don't need to mark it. And we're looking for some type of 5 chord after this, which is what we get. F, A, F, and C. Coincidentally, the last cadence having probably the clearest 5 chord in the entire chorale, cadentially speaking. But this is our 5 chord. F is a chord tone, E flat is a passing 7th, and then we cadence on B flat, F, D, and B flat, which is our tonic triad in root position, concluding this chorale. So all in all, I think the 2 big takeaways from this chorale are, like I mentioned and I've pretty much talked about at length, it was sort of the big talking point about this chorale is 5 chords and why I analyzed them the way that I did. All in all, not super important, because the fact that the 5 is sort of being implied over this really active bass line kind of undermines the same level analysis that if these 5 chords existed with a slower bass line, like if we have the rhythms of the bass line and then we still had 5-4-2 chords and they didn't resolve, I feel like that'd be a more interesting talking point. But here, because the bass line is really like this flowing river, it kind of just meanders and goes the way that it does, and eventually winds up at the tone at our cadence where it slows down very abruptly. But other than that, this idea of a potential tonic 7th chord is interesting. It's something that's popped up in a couple of chorales recently, this idea of the tonic 7th, and I wonder if this is just because, this is something going on in and around Bach's life at this time, but not a lot of tonic 7th chords getting emphasis like they have been in the last couple of chorales we've looked at. But that's pretty much everything I wanted to talk about today. If you're interested in following along on the journey to analyze all of Bach's chorale harmonizations, feel free to subscribe to the channel. You can hit the notification icon as well and like the video if you liked the content. Thank you so much for watching the video and supporting the channel by doing so. I look forward to tomorrow's analysis, and I hope you take care.